My name is Michal Skuza, and today I'm here to talk about perspective, what it is, why it's relevant in software development, and what are some of the common pitfalls and misconceptions related to it. So let's start with a definition. According to Cambridge Dictionary, perspective is a particular way of viewing things that depends on one's experience and personality. But what does that mean exactly? How do those things, experience and personality, affect our perspective? So let's start with experience. I think it's safe to say that the global pandemic changed the perspective of every one of us when it comes to the topic of working from home. It was unthinkable 2 years ago that such an arrangement could work well in the long term and on such a scale, but look at us now. And secondly, in order to understand how personality affects our perspective, let's consider a more detailed breakdown of what personality actually consists of, starting with our values and beliefs. So whether they are coming from our culture or just our personal path to enlightenment, how can they affect our perspective? When I was looking for the definition to use on the first slide, I came across a quote that I think illustrates this nicely. If you believe that toys corrupt children's minds, then from your perspective, a toy shop is an evil place. So in other words, our perception of reality is affected by what we consider to be right or wrong. Next, our mood or general state of mind. So our emotions can have a major impact on how we perceive the world around us. Let's consider the following scenario. Let's say we're at the office and we just bumped into someone spilling the coffee we just made. We didn't burn ourselves or anything, so really it's just a minor inconvenience. But what if that same morning we caught a flat tire and spent an hour waiting for the road assistance? And we didn't get enough sleep because our neighbors were having a party last night. So it all accumulates, and now our reaction to this situation can be completely different than what it would have been on any other day. Next are fears and inhibitions. So let's consider two people looking at a pool. It's a hot summer day, and one of those people, they know how to swim, the other one, they don't know how to swim. So looking at the same thing, the same exact pool, the first person sees something good, something nice, a way to cool down. But the second person looking at the same exact pool might see something entirely different. They might see a death trap because they don't know how to swim. And lastly, our assumptions. So this can be anything really. For example, we can assume that somebody is incompetent, and that will alter our perception of everything that person says and does. Okay, so to summarize the factors that can affect our perspective, as you can see, most of the things listed here, they are things that change over time, like our experience, all the factors listed here. And that means that our perspective is not something static. It evolves over time, and it can also change from day to day, depending on the factors listed here. So now, before I proceed with a deep dive into perspectives, I would like to share with you some of the experiences that have shaped my perspective. So hopefully this helps you to understand why I'm talking about this and where I'm coming from. So firstly, more than 10 years of writing code. And while in my current role of a technical product owner, I don't spend as much time writing code as I used to, I still can't imagine isolating myself from the code completely. So writing code is at the very heart of software development. So I strongly believe that my programming experience actually helps me to perform my product owner duties better. Next, 16 different Scrum teams. So throughout the years, I had the opportunity of working with many different teams, and that allowed me to see some commonalities and also some differences. So while no two teams are ever exactly the same, and the same process or practice implemented in two different teams can have completely opposite results, I think there are also some common problems that are pretty much independent of the team size and what technology the team is using. Next, 12 different products. And similarly to working with multiple teams, working on multiple different products allowed me to see different approaches to implementing a similar thing, completely different approaches to implementing the same thing. So over time, it allowed me to realize that in software development, it's all about the trade-offs, really. So usually there's more than one way of doing something, and depending on which solution we choose, we might end up with different problems, but there are no problem-free solutions. So whatever decision we make, this will always lead to some new problem to solve. 3 different organizations. So changing an organization or a department at a company like Motorola Solutions can feel pretty close to changing a company. So different people, different technology stack, different goals. Doing changes like that allowed me to become more comfortable about leaving my comfort zone. And last but not least, I've spent 4 years living and working in the US. And there are 2 things that changed my perspective through this experience, both the professional one and my personal perspective. So firstly, experiencing other cultures allowed me to better understand my own culture, but also the thing that was different about working in the US was the amount of experience that my teammates had. So when I was still back in Poland, I had a few guys in my team that I considered to be very experienced because they had between 5 and 10 years of professional experience. But then when I moved to the US, I started working with some people who had 20, 30, or even 35 years of experience. And I was 26 years old at the time. So can you imagine a knowledge gap between a 26-year-old and someone who has been creating software for 35 years? So having daily interactions with those guys allowed me to realize just how much I still have to learn. Okay, and hopefully this brief background helps you to understand why I'm presenting this. And now going back to the deep dive into perspectives. So far, what I've said was the definition and the factors that affect our perspective, but it is all still very general and hard to apply to our daily work. So let's try to visualize perspectives in the context of a specific problem or product. And to do that, I'm going to use a picture I found in the internet. You might be familiar with it. So let's start with the most fundamental ingredient of any problem or product, which is simply the raw data related to it. So if we're talking about a software product, this might be, for example, it is a web application written in Java 11. It uses certificates. We have 500 customers actively using the product. 30 staff months were spent developing it, and so on and so on. We have a large bag of facts without any rhyme or reason to them. So next step is categorization of that raw data. By categorizing the facts that we have, we can get something that's much more valuable, and that's information. The categories will depend on the context, but for any software product, we can probably come up with some common categories like functional requirements, performance requirements, usage data, technology stack, and so on. In this form, our raw bag of facts becomes much more useful because we can quickly look up a specific aspect of our product that we're currently interested in. Next step is connecting the dots. So what are the connections between our data points? How do our security requirements affect usability or performance? What third-party libraries are we using to secure our REST API with certificates? Connecting the dots allows us to gain knowledge about our product. And this doesn't necessarily have to be technical knowledge. It all depends on the information that is available. And once our initial data set is organized into knowledge, there's 2 distinct phenomena that we can observe on it. First one is insight. In this context, insight is instinctively making leap connections between data points. So in the case of our product, this might be, for example, that we support 10,000 users provisioned in our application today, but if we increase that number to 15,000, then the application will crash. We don't know what exactly will crash, which component will fail, but we know enough about our application that we're sure that something will go wrong. And the second phenomenon that we can observe is wisdom. Wisdom is very similar to insight, the core difference being that we know every detail. We know every step along the way. So in our previous example, we know that our application will fail if we increase the number of users by 50% because of the currently used data model and how database queries were implemented with entire tables being loaded into memory by multiple times by different application components, which with the current hardware specs and memory allocation to the JVM will cause an out-of-memory exception. So every detail along the way. Like I mentioned before, this doesn't necessarily have to be technical. It might be business-related, sales-related. It all depends on what is the data set available to us. There's one more panel to this drawing, but I'm saving that for later. And you can imagine that for a complex problem or product, we could have hundreds or even thousands of data points, and the amount of knowledge needed to cover every single aspect of it might be more than any single person can comprehend. And that is very often the case for products at Motorola Solutions, since we are working on some of the most complex communication systems in the world. Multiple perspectives are needed in order to create a new product or even to make any significant change to an existing product. So let's consider what are those perspectives? What are the different high-level perspectives that are needed for a company like Motorola Solutions to create and release a new product? Oh, sorry, one more thing here. So what is perspective? This whole visualization, the purpose of it was to get here. So perspective in the context of a particular problem or product is a sum of our insights and knowledge related to that topic. Okay, and the high-level perspective. So let's start with our perspective, engineering. So somebody will have to create that new product, and without the technical expertise, that's simply not going to happen. Next is business. So we're not creating a new product just because we have the technical expertise to do so, but rather to generate revenue for the company. So is this new product the best way of doing that? Maybe there are other better opportunities that we should pursue first. Next is marketing. So how are we going to promote our product? How are we going to convince our customers that this is something new, something better, and they should buy it? Next is supply chain. So if our new product is, for example, a new radio model or anything else that involves hardware, then most likely we will be using some third-party components. And we need to make sure that we have continuity of supply to get those components so we can put them together and release under our product. Next is manufacturing. So if any kind of hardware is involved, we'll probably need a factory process to either put the hardware components together or just to install some software on some third-party hardware that we ordered. Next is legal, to make sure that we're protected against liability and that we are compliant with all the applicable laws and regulations. Ordering. So how are our customers going to order our product? Is it only going to be through salespeople? Is there an automated ordering system that they can use? What are the options available when they are ordering it? Project management. So since we have so many high-level perspectives already, and most likely they are spread across multiple departments, we'll need someone to coordinate the project, to make sure that all the dependencies are identified, that we set milestones to monitor progress along the way, and to make decisions about scope reductions or increases. And last but not least is the customer or end user perspective. So we want to make sure that what we're creating actually fits the needs of our customers. We don't want to spend a year developing a product that nobody will use. And as you can see, we already have a pretty large number of different high-level perspectives. I'm sure there's more that I haven't thought of here. And additionally, if we double-click on any of those high-level categories, we can identify even more specialized perspectives that are under each one of them. So let's take engineering, for example. In engineering, we can identify at least 3 different perspectives based on a role: architecture, development, and testing. But if we take another approach and look at different aspects of our product, we can identify more perspectives like security, deployment, front-end, back-end, usability, and many others. Software development is such a complicated domain that we can find people specializing in anything, really. We have people specializing only in Linux or Windows platforms. We have database experts for different kinds of databases, AWS experts, Azure experts, test automation experts, hardware experts, the list goes on. So that means that in reality, going back to our high-level picture, that means that in order to launch a new product at a company like Motorola Solutions, we will need dozens of different perspectives to be successful. And the key takeaway here is just realizing that all those different perspectives exist, and that when looking at the same exact problem or product, the same data set, those different perspectives can see very different things. Okay, so since we have so many different perspectives and there are multiple factors that change over time that affect our perspective, you can imagine that there is some complexity to this topic. And that can lead to issues. So let's consider some scenarios that are inspired by true events that illustrate some of those common problems and pitfalls related to perspectives. Starting with ignoring other perspectives. Let's consider a scenario where we're developers participating in integration testing efforts. The idea is that we have multiple product teams coming together in the integration lab to try to integrate their products into a working system or subsystem. And this integration effort has a daily stand-up, which in theory is supposed to be a 10 to 15-minute meeting where we talk about issues, share our knowledge and experience, and just try to stay in sync on the whole integration effort. But that's the theory. And then there's reality. In reality, in a lot of cases, in stand-up meetings like this, people start talking about their individual products in such a level of detail that other people simply don't know what they are talking about. And then maybe there's one other person in that meeting out of 10 people total who uses a similar technology stack and who understands that level of detail, that starts asking questions and making suggestions, and it's like they are speaking in code. So you have no idea what they are saying. You take a look around, and it's not just you. It seems like almost everyone is out of the loop. So the meeting ends up taking 30+ minutes, and if somebody were to ask you what was said during that meeting, you wouldn't be able to tell them because you simply lost track at certain point. So let's use our previous data visualization example to examine more closely what happened here. To simplify things a little bit, let's consider a stand-up meeting of 3 people, Arnold, Betty, and Chloe. And this rectangle in the middle is set of knowledge and insights relevant to the problem of integration testing. We have some knowledge and insights populated there already because we know what we're trying to achieve, right? We know what the system is supposed to do, what the end goal is. So now let's consider what happened in that stand-up meeting of ours. So Arnold starts speaking, but the things that he is saying aren't all that relevant to the problem at hand, which is integration testing. So by going into too much detail about their product, Arnold is introducing a much higher entry point for the discussion. So now only people who are aware of this level of detail can join in. And that's exactly what Betty does. So Betty uses a similar technology stack. So she joins in, asks questions, makes suggestions. And this way, they are creating a side discussion that revolves around the topics that are relevant to only Arnold and Betty. This might be, for example, a low-level technical discussion about setting up replication in Postgres database, anything. So the problem here is that Chloe has no idea what they are talking about. She doesn't use Postgres. She's there for integration testing efforts. And this level of detail is not interesting to her at all. And even though some of what Arnold and Betty are saying might be relevant to the problem at hand, it becomes pretty much impossible for Chloe to identify those pieces of information when they are buried under the mountain of other data that simply isn't relevant to her. So this is the situation in which if you were to ask Chloe what was discussed in that stand-up meeting, she wouldn't be able to tell you. She'll say Postgres something, right? So now let's consider what was the original intent of the meeting, how it should have looked like instead of this. So we have the same exact starting point. We have Arnold, Betty, and Chloe, and some knowledge populated in the middle already. And let's say Arnold starts speaking here. And this time, Arnold tries to keep things relevant and he's not going outside of the shared area of relevance, which is integration testing. Next, Betty joins in and does the same. So she offers less information, fewer insights, but more relevant to the topic at hand. And then lastly, Chloe joins in and does the same. The nice thing about this is we can even come up with additional insights on the spot. So if we are paying attention to what everyone else is saying, we can actually join the knowledge and insights that they are offering with our knowledge and insights and come up with additional connections on the spot. And this is in theory how all stand-ups should look like, right? Maximizing the common shared value and minimizing the side discussions as much as possible. And while this might be the holy grail and it might be impossible in most cases to avoid those side discussions, this is what we should be optimizing towards. And as long as we try our best to keep things relevant and not go into too much detail that certain participants of the meeting won't understand, we will still get a lot of value from having those meetings. Okay, so now for our second scenario that illustrates the problem of ignoring other perspectives, let's consider a sprint demo or a sprint review or whatever name you're using for a meeting where you get together with your stakeholders to present the latest product increment and get feedback. And first, let's consider a typical work breakdown for a new feature that we're introducing to our product. Usually, we have some initiative at the top, which is broken down into multiple epics. They might be broken down by team or component or whatever criteria. And then those epics are broken down further into individual stories that the developers are taking into their sprint. And if we think about our stakeholders in this context, then most of them are probably only relevant of, are probably only aware of this work breakdown at the initiative level. There might be some that also track this work on the epic level, but most likely none of them will be aware of the individual stories that are under each epic. But what is it that our developers are working on? Our bread and butter is this, those individual stories under each epic. This is our unit of work that we're taking into the sprint. So what is it that our developers are going to present at the sprint demo? Well, they are going to present stories. In this case, we have one developer presenting story 1 and story 2, another presenting story 3, and third one presenting story 4. So the problem here is that if our stakeholders are tracking the work on the initiative level and we're presenting the work that we've completed on the story level, then we have a disconnect here right from the start. So I've been to multiple sprint demo meetings where feedback from stakeholders was pretty much non-existent. Like there were no questions asked, no comments made, and I was wondering like, what what is the purpose of even having those meetings if we're not interacting with each other? So after one such meeting, I reached out to one of the stakeholders that I knew, and I pressed him for answers. I wanted to learn whether what we presented was actually good or bad, if they liked what was shown or not. And that stakeholder admitted to me that they didn't really understand what was shown during the demo. The level of technical detail was simply too great, and they couldn't place what they were seeing in the larger scheme of things, which is the use case that we're trying to fulfill for our customers. So this initiative level. So if we use our previous data visualization example, this is what's happening. We have two separate sets of knowledge that is relevant to our participants. On the left, we have our developers and the development team's knowledge and insights, which mostly focus on the how things are done. While on the other hand, we have our stakeholders who are mostly focused on the why and the what. They don't really care that much about the how. So we end up with both sides of this meeting being frustrated. The developers, because they didn't get any feedback, so they feel like the stakeholders don't care about the work that they are doing. And the stakeholders are frustrated because, well, they don't understand what it is that we're showing. So what can we do in this situation in order to get more out of our stakeholders, to help them participate actively in this meeting? Well, we need to connect the dots for them. And what does that mean in this context? It means providing some background before we actually start showing our work. So even something very high level, like saying this is some preliminary backend work that will enable this and that use case to be implemented in the next iteration, will help our stakeholders to place the things that we are showing in the larger scheme of things, in this initiative level breakdown. And in my experience, meetings where this high-level context is given results in much more discussion between the developers and the stakeholders, and it helps keep everyone on the same page. Okay, so that concludes the topic of ignoring other perspective and brings us to our second common pitfall, which is right and wrong perspective. Let's consider a scenario where we have a product owner and a development manager. And let's say that they are both experienced, that they've worked with multiple teams before, they've seen their share of different problems and solutions to those problems. And let's say that now those two guys are working with a new, freshly formed development team, which is enthusiastic but lacks experience. And let's say that this new development team just went through their sprint planning and they started work on their latest product increment. But the product owner notices that each individual member of the team is just focusing on their own task and they are not really looking at the sprint as a whole. So there's not much collaboration between the team. And the product owner is experienced, so he knows that the way things are going, this is not going to be a successful sprint. The sprint's goal is to deliver some working functionality. But the way things are going, what we will end up with is a bunch of individual pieces that just don't fit together because we lack this collaboration between the team. So our product owner approaches the development manager and he says, hey, I see that our team is running into this problem. We've seen such problems before, right? We know what can be done to address them. So how do you think we should approach our development team so that they can change direction and well, have a successful sprint after all? And the development manager says, let's do nothing. Let them fail. And if you think about it from the development manager's perspective, whose top priority is the team and their growth, then it makes perfect sense. Let the team, don't just hand a solution to the team, let them fail together, let them overcome the obstacle on their own so they can learn from it. So fail now so they can succeed later. Makes sense, right? But then if you look at it from the product owner's perspective, whose top priority are the business commitments and the product itself, then you could approach it like this. Okay, so you're telling me that we see a problem, we know exactly what the problem is, we know what can be done to fix it, but instead we're just going to do nothing. We're going to sacrifice an entire sprint worth of work just so we can have a team building exercise. So if you put it like that, it doesn't make so much sense anymore, right? So then who is right and who is wrong in this scenario? The development manager or the product owner? Right, they are both right. So just because one of them is right doesn't mean that the other one is wrong. It all depends on what perspective we're going to assume when looking at the problem. And you can imagine that this situation can even lead to a conflict between the product owner and the development manager, because they are both right. So if they both just dig in and think only about their own perspective, they can spend a lot of time and energy arguing about what the best course of action is. So how can we resolve this situation? What can we do here? How can we make a decision which route we should take? Well, there's two different approaches. In one approach, we can introduce a third perspective to our problem, and maybe having somebody else comment on it will weight the scales and help us to choose which way is better. Maybe it will depend on the current priorities of our organization and where we are in terms of our business commitments, if we have any contracts that will result in fees that we have to pay if we don't deliver. But there is also another approach that could be taken here, and that's we could try to reach a compromise between the product owner and the development manager. Maybe we don't need to sacrifice the entire sprint. Maybe we can kind of force an early integration so the team notices the problem earlier and they will still have time to recover from this path. To kind of force closer collaboration between the team a little bit earlier. Okay, so for our second scenario related to right and wrong perspective, let me ask you this. Did you ever criticize other products, technical decisions made, or any decisions really that were made by some other team some time ago? I know that I have, and I've done it more times than I care to admit. And I used to flat out say that this technical decision is stupid. And a few years ago, I had this manager who told me that there are no stupid decisions made at our company. We only have smart people at Motorola Solutions, so there are always reasons why we're doing things. And if we only spend the time and ask the right questions, get familiar with what was the reasoning behind making a decision, then it will start making sense to us. So thinking back on it, it reminds me of this guy. Do you know who this is? Yes, thank you, Veronica. This is Captain Hindsight. There was this South Park episode where there was a catastrophe. So there's a building burning, people screaming, smoke everywhere, and then Captain Hindsight flies in. Captain Hindsight is a superhero who can fly, and he has a superhuman power of hindsight. So he flies in, he addresses the crowd and tells them what they should have done differently in order not to be in this situation. And then he flies away, the crowd is cheering, thank you, Captain Hindsight, the building is still burning, people are still screaming, right, smoke everywhere. But yeah, Captain Hindsight to the rescue. So you see, ultimately, trying to judge decisions retrospectively isn't really helpful for anyone. And additionally, we need to consider here that we don't know what was the knowledge set that was available at the time of making a decision. So let's try to consider a chart of time on x-axis and knowledge on the y-axis. So by the time we reach our decision point, we have a certain amount of knowledge and insights that are available to us. And we're going to use that when we're making that decision, right? But then if we fast forward a few weeks or months into the future, then at that point, our knowledge set is much more vast. We've made that decision already. So let's say we decided to go with a specific technology. we've lived with this decision for those few weeks or months. So now we know a lot more than we did back then. And looking back at the decision point, we might be tempted to say, oh, we should have gone with the other decision because that would save us a lot of trouble in the end. Because we know already what we had to go through after making this decision, right? But the problem is, do we really know that? That making a different decision would result in fewer problems? So we're just speculating, right? We're thinking that, well, a different decision might put us in a different spot, but we haven't lived through that. So this is the problem of a road not taken. And to illustrate what that problem is about, let's say we're at a crossroads. My crossroads is a little uglier than in the previous presentation, but let's say we don't know the left path or the right path, and at this point we might as well flip a coin. And let's say we ended up going left, which didn't turn out that great because we got lost at the forest at night, freezing our asses off. So in the morning, we might be tempted to say, oh, we should have taken the other path. But maybe if we have taken the other path, then we would have ended up in a swamp with alligators and leeches and snakes. So you see, when we were at our crossroads, we couldn't have known what the better decision was. But even after traveling the left path, that still doesn't mean that we have enough information to say that making a different decision in the past would have put us in a better place now. So where I'm going with this is don't be Captain Hindsight. Try not to judge things that already happened. Like providing immediate feedback when the decision is being made might be helpful, but trying to say, oh, 3 months back we shouldn't have done this, that's not helping anyone. Okay, and since we're in the context of right and wrong perspective, it's time for our to reveal the last panel of this drawing I found on the internet. And this last panel shows what happens when we get, let's say, creative at the knowledge phase when we are connecting the dots. And as you can see, we end up with a conspiracy theory. Now, at first glance, it doesn't make much sense, but at the very least, we have to admit that this is an interesting perspective on the problem. It might be total bullshit, or it might be a stroke of genius and a prime example of out-of-the-box thinking. But we will never know which one it is unless we at least consider things from this seemingly crazy perspective. So this is my little twist on this whole drawing, that the original intent was making fun of the conspiracy theory. What I'm saying is don't make fun of it, at least not until you have all the facts. Okay, so that concludes the topic of right and wrong perspective and brings us to the last common pitfall, or more of a misconception, that a single person can have only a single perspective. So in a lot of cases, we tend to look at people through the lens of their role. So if someone is a people manager and they start talking to us about topics related to people management, we're going to listen because, well, they are a people manager. They know what they are talking about, right? But if that same person starts talking about software architecture, then that raises a red flag. Because, well, what do they know about software architecture? They're not an architect. But the thing is, we never really know the true extent of somebody else's knowledge and experience. So it might be that that person is more experienced in the perspective of a people manager than in the architecture department. But that doesn't mean that they have nothing to contribute. And ultimately, what matters is whether what they are saying makes sense or not, and not what their current position or pay grade is. So it's actually pretty common for people to have multiple perspectives and to try to cover multiple perspectives even during a single meeting. And that only introduces one small problem. And that is, if I'm trying to cover multiple different perspectives in a single meeting, especially if those are perspectives that present opposing points of view, it might be difficult for my listeners to keep track of what perspective I'm trying to cover at the moment. And some people address this by saying outright, like from development perspective, from usability perspective, from project management perspective, blah, blah, blah. And this way, verbally noting every change in the point of view that we're making. It helps to keep things organized, and I try to use this practice myself, but there's also another approach that I like very much, and that's the hat metaphor. So the concept is very simple. Let's imagine that different perspectives are simply different hats that a person can put on and off at their leisure. So then instead of stating from development perspective, from that perspective, blah, 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 I would just say once, okay, now I'm putting on my architect hat. So this way, my listeners know that everything I'm about to say is from the architect's perspective. And then when I'm done with that, I can say, okay, I'm taking off my architect hat and I'm putting on my UI UX designer hat. So the advantage of this approach is it not only helps to keep things organized and our listeners to keep track of what we're saying, but it's also a good mental exercise for us, which allows us to put ourselves in the other shoes or different hat. So think about it. What are the hats that you have in your wardrobe? And what are the hats that you would like to have? Are you open to getting a new hat, or is it that you're already set on what hat you like to wear? And maybe the only one that you like is a baseball cap, and the only hat that you're willing to replace it with is a newer, more shiny baseball cap. And that's okay too, but try to look at your nearest environment, your team, and appreciate the number of different hats that people are wearing, and just imagine how dull the world would be if everyone wore the same hat as everyone else. So I don't know about you, but to me, a world in which we can appreciate the variety of hats has much more appeal to it. Okay, so the last thing I would like to cover today is perspective seeking. So how can we learn other perspectives? Is it something we can do on our own? Can I just read a book and become an architect? Well, maybe, but that's not what works for me. So for me, what works is learning from others. So it all starts with noticing a certain behavior that you like, that you think, oh, what that guy did that's cool. I would like to be able to do that. And then talking to that person, trying to understand what knowledge they have that I don't, and what aspects they are considering when making a decision. So this helps to get into their shoes or in their hat. And over time, this approach helps us to, well, mimic the certain behaviors that we find attractive in some way. So this is actually how I got my architect hat. That a few years ago, when I was still working as a developer, I used to go to my team architect a lot with various questions. The common theme was that I ran into a problem and I didn't know how to proceed, so I went to him and he gave me a solution to that problem. But a lot of times after talking to him, I was thinking to myself that the solution was just so obvious. Why couldn't I come up with it? Did I really have to bother the architect? Couldn't I have just came up with it on my own? So then the next time that I ran into this situation, I decided to stop myself. So instead of going to the architect, I would sit down, I would try to really think things through and consider what is the knowledge that I need in order to make a decision here. What are the aspects that the architect would consider that I haven't? So it didn't happen overnight, but eventually this approach allowed me to become more confident in my own abilities and more independent of the team's architect. And like I said, it did take a long time. So my advice here is be patient, keep an open mind, and try on new hats. Maybe eventually you will find one that fits you nicely. Okay, so to summarize what I was trying to say in the previous 69 slides, there are basically 3 steps to expanding our own perspective. The first step is awareness. So just realizing that all those different perspectives exist and that looking at the same exact problem, the same data set, those perspectives can see very different things. The next step is mindfulness. So this is where we start paying attention to what are the perspectives of other people present in a meeting, and take that into account when we're speaking to keep what we're saying on the appropriate level of detail and relevant to the problem at hand. And then the third and the last step is perspective seeking. So this is actively trying to mimic some of the behaviors that we notice and we think that are cool. So in other words, this is where we are opening ourselves up to the variety of other hats available out there, and being open to trying things on. And maybe after a while, after trying a few different hats, we will find one that we want to keep. And that's pretty much all I had. So I have some references here with links to short articles that I found relevant to the topic and the resources I used in the presentation. So with that, I would like to open for questions. Yes.
Okay, thanks for that presentation. It was very interesting. I have one comment and one question. Comment is about this perspectives you mentioned, that it is very useful also from facilitation perspective. When you facilitate the meeting or create the meeting, even in calendar or whatever, it is very extremely useful to identify those perspectives and even ask our stakeholders, okay, you're a great guy, you know, you have a lot of perspectives, but I would like you to focus on that perspective. It will be very useful for me because, you know, you'll be the only one or only a couple of people with such perspective. If you can focus on that perspective during our meeting or whatever, I would be grateful. And it can help us to identify this perspective and also somehow facilitate that meeting and cover those perspectives. And this is the comment. And the question is, you mentioned about demo sessions and about this building that developers want to talk about stories, right? Stakeholders want to listen about initiatives, and we need to build this bridge at the beginning, right? So give the background. I just wonder, and this is my doubt, if this is enough. I mean, because if we build this bridge and give this background at the beginning, but developers will still tell about the stories, I'm not sure if this is enough for stakeholders to, you know, start understanding this content. If content is still about the stories, even with this introduction, I don't know what do you think about it? How to keep this bridge open, let's say.
So yeah, building this bridge can be difficult, right? Because it all depends on how far those individual stories, those small pieces of work are to a working piece of functionality that our stakeholder is tracking on the initiative level. But I found that if we try to keep the team informed throughout the development process about what it is that this whole initiative is trying to achieve, so give them more context than just the stories that they are working on, then it becomes easier for them to give this introduction, this background when they are presenting a story, because they know where this piece of work fits in the overall initiative. So there are many different tools that we can use to bridge this gap. We can also use product goals that are more on a higher level, maybe something between the initiative and the story, like on the epic level, where the team is aware that their sprint goal is to deliver this piece of working functionality. And yeah, that can help in bridging this gap, but nobody said it will be easy.